Okay, welcome to the next episode of Digital Transformation Chats, and I just want to introduce Tony Matejczyk from the Matejczyk Group. I've known Anthony probably for more than a decade. We worked together at a CRO company, and it was a fantastic experience, and Anthony has a ton of experience on organizational design. So you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Colin. Yeah, it's great to be here with you. I for the last several years have been doing work with, largely Fortune 500 companies around exactly what you said, organizational design. The idea is that companies have a strategy they want to deploy, and they often need help thinking through how do we design an organization to best enable that strategy. So it's exciting work, and even more fun is when you get to deploy it and see it successful. So I'm really glad to talk to you about this, and also about digital transformation, which is a huge part of the portfolio of work I deal with. So
yeah, I think one of the missing aspects that's not talked very much is about how the organization needs to be aligned with whatever strategy that you're doing. A lot of people seem to pick up the airline magazines and read an article. I think probably one of the hot organizational models is the Spotify model, where you have teams and guilds and all of that. A lot of people actually end up struggling with implementation of the various models because they don't really get into the depth of this. What have you seen in talking to organizations about their struggles with the different organizational models?
Right. So you're right. Most companies that I work with have some level of the use of the Spotify model as metaphor. The idea here is that they think about agile, scrum teams and sprints and MVPs, and they'll talk about it and use the lexicon, but don't necessarily behave and operate in a manner that's conducive to taking advantage of those, what that brings you,
Right.
Agility, speed to product, speed to delivery for the customer, continual ability to evolve the product to meet the customer's needs, having strong product ownership. So those are things that we often deal with. Part of it, part of the work I often have to do is to ask the question, so what are we trying to accomplish? Rather than take a metaphor and apply it and hope it works, what is the real business problem? And, oftentimes it's things like we have issues with agility. We have issues with being data-driven and consuming our data. And, the solutions vary, right? But it's not often sort of like you said in the airline magazine that if we just plug and play the, what we read from the Agile manifesto, everything's going to be okay.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't understand that there's a lot of tools and a lot of processes that Spotify actually matured before they went into this whole organizational model that they evolved to. It was a big evolution over a period of time, and I think a lot of companies seem to struggle with this. Of
Yes.
They don't have the base kind of set of tools and processes, and they want to suddenly take several hundred people and they walk away Friday evening, and then Monday morning the organization has suddenly shifted.
Yes.
And then they don't think about through all of the issues about that, versus companies like Spotify, it was a very much an evolution, and it wasn't A to B. There was a lot of zigzagging that they did, and a lot of training and process improvement, and they actually involved a lot of their staff. Versus, I feel like what tends to happen is certain models get shoved down from the top, versus Spotify seemed to be much more of a grassroots bottom up approach. So how do you work with companies basically you tend to be brought in at the executive level, but then these models really need sometimes to be bought in by the grassroots. So how do you work to achieve that?
Right. So, generally speaking, if we, we can take the Spotify model as an example. Let's use that as an example. So, I worked with a client in the Boston area that was looking to move not necessarily to the full Spotify model, but something akin to a Scrum-based model with a true Agile model from what was previously largely a waterfall-based development shop. And rather than look at the sort of components of Agile, there are some sort of underlying table stakes around organizations and people that I think are necessary in order to be successful in a Spotify-like model. There are a few that come to mind immediately. I think the first one is, as a leadership team and as an organization, what's our tolerance for risk? What's our willingness to build things that may not work, or build things that we need to continually modify and that may take time. A lot of companies may talk the talk of a willingness to continually iterate. A lot of them don't have the patience,
Right.
And they're not willing to risk uncertainty, right? Most companies don't like uncertainty, especially public companies that have to report results. I think the second thing that when it comes to the Spotify model or others of that ilk is one of the key things that's really important is crisp and quick decision making, right?
Right.
and in a lot of organizations that have operated in a way that's consensus driven or informality and again sort of mitigating risk, there's a dread for establishing what are the clear decision rights that individuals in the organization exist and our willingness to accept and abide by them, right? Even if they're imperfect. And so what happens is when you go for example, towards product development, the ability to sort of turn something off, right? And say, we're not going to do this anymore. That's a really hard decision for most companies, and whether it be in technology development or other types of product development. I mean, I've worked for companies that do, animal health and nutrition, and they can't stop products that they know are going to fail because they have a hard time making decisions. So I think decision rights are something we look at and say, what is necessary, and how do we make sure that we actually deploy them?
I always feel there's safety in numbers with group decision making. And I've seen this in a lot of organizations where the decision maker doesn't want to actually make the decision because they don't want to be out there doing that, right? They actually want to say, okay, we need to get everybody together and make certain decisions. And we see this a lot with Agile. When I've been doing Agile transformations, the business really seems to struggle in actually saying, okay, I am going to make a decision, today.
Yes.
And they want to think about it and revisit it. And it doesn't work in an Agile. If you really want to go fast and develop new solutions very quickly, you need to make these decisions and move on. And yes, Agile helps with all of that process, but it can come to a grinding halt if people want to revisit the decisions and say, no, I want this feature, now versus I said I would wait for it. So how do you work with organizations to get them where there is going to be a single decision maker, or once we do make a decision, we're going to stick with it for a period of time?
Right. So as simple as this may sound, it's extremely important to sit down and document decision rights, as silly as that sounds. And I know everyone's probably heard the dreaded, RACI decision matrix, right? So everybody hates RACI, but I'm actually a believer that if you build a RACI with the intent of living by it, it's a powerful tool. And what I mean by that is that if you build a RACI around, say, a product development process, which I've done with a client on every step, and if you think of it like you build it and then you print it out and laminate it, and everyone has it in their wallet, and when then there's a conflict, your ability to pull that out and say, I own this decision, right? That, therefore, RACI becomes a powerful tool, rather than just an exercise to make ourselves feel better. That's the hardest part, right? It's actually living by that decision. So you asked, like, how do you do it? So if you're in a design mode and you're trying to get an organization to pivot towards crisper decision making, incredibly, simulations work well. So if you ask it, you bring a bunch of leaders into a workshop, they've built and they think they understand their decision rights. Before you leave, let's pick a couple of really hairy scenarios that are going to test this, and let's see how it plays out, right? Does it pass the red face test? And more often than not, when you practice it, it doesn't, right? So it means you got to do it more, right? So that's another thing. The other piece I find is that, building it candidly in OKRs. My objective is I need to be able to hit this, and here are the key results that are required, and that requires me to be a decision maker. Just a few examples.
Yeah. The other issue that I tend to see quite a bit is people making a transition from a project-focused organization to a product-focused organization. And there's a lot of processes around that, having been very product focused,
yes,
as well as a lot of finance issues, because you normally, with a project, you
yes,
have a start and a stop and a budget. But with a product, it tends to be much more never ending. And I've actually seen quite good success. In my previous organization, I'd actually had one of the longest running Scrum teams in the organization. And it was just a matter of, we always fed at work. We had a very disciplined process. A lot of people seem to struggle with that because from a finance perspective, they can't get their head around it. Well, it's got to be a thing, and we're going to, fund building of a thing versus an evolution. So have you seen the same thing? And how do you get people over the hump from project to product?
Yeah, not easily. Not easily at all. For all the reasons you mentioned. I spend a lot of time with finance people, and like you said, I mean, their language is, I need to understand what the budget is. I need to understand, how much we're going to capitalize, and it needs to be predictable, right? And I can't have I need to be able to understand how it's bucketized. I'll be honest. I mean, most organizations who do IT really do struggle with the idea of creating, a larger pool of money from which to draw in order to deliver product. Part of that, I think, results from the fact that IT doesn't necessarily think of itself as a part of the business, right? So they see their budget as being separate and distinct from what the business is delivering. So they're very protective of IT's money. Where it works is when, the business is actually funding the work, right? And it's their money, and IT is allocated resources towards it, right? So it kind of loosens the constraints that IT finance folks have. It's that, convergence of the business with IT as one unit, I think really does help. Doesn't always work, but it helps.
Yeah, and I think there's probably a lot of struggles for large organizations because of all the fiefdoms that have been created over time, where IT, and then under IT, you have an operations budget, you have an application development budget, and an information security budget. And you look at some of the more modern organizations, especially the startups, where it's actually all collapsed into one, right? The application development actually support production. And now there's a lot of the technologies where everything is code, right? Infrastructure is code, security is code, code is code. And so a lot of this is starting to meld together. So how larger organizations have been historically set up with these different groups, different budgets, and of
Yes.
course, people with different egos
Yes.
actually start to meld together into one organization.
Yeah. So I want to maybe take a smaller example, which is you're referencing, DevOps, right?
Right.
And even within technology, a technology group, the lines have always been, as it's like we have our run organization, we have our build organization, and those two are separate and distinct, right? And we are seeing a lot. DevOps as a concept is powerful. Where it's most powerful is when there's a single owner of the product, right? And the people who work to develop that product are they're both cutting the code and supporting it.
Right.
It's still a stretch for a lot of groups, right? Because people who do development don't necessarily want to be supporting what the code is, So, where I found that within IT, the extent to which you break down those walls, you also begin to see different behaviors, right? You start to see better coding results. You see move towards simplicity. These are all good things. But the problem is that a lot of folks haven't grown up in that mindset.
Yeah, I love having the discussions with people and saying, look, nobody should be accessing production, right? You always get into developers shouldn't touch production, and operations people shouldn't be, writing code. And now with all of the tools and all of the philosophy, it's like, well, nobody should really be touching production. It's all an automatic deployment. And you even get into some of the modern technologies like containers.
Yeah.
Or now you have a container that doesn't have shell access. So how are you actually going to touch production? We don't want anybody in production from a security perspective, but also you don't want people making manual changes. The number of times I've seen where,
Yes.
somebody well-intentioned has made a manual change, and all of a sudden it comes back to bite you later on. And so if you have everything as code, configuration, application security, even the infrastructure, you can always look back to see what's happened, who's changed what, and all of the CI/CD processes for DevOps, right? Basically means that nobody should be touching production. All of the data that you need to look at a system, there's tools to do that, and you can do it from the comfort of your desktop, in effect.
Indeed. Yeah, and I worked with a company that was moving towards, like you said, microservices and, infrastructure as code. And it's a journey. It's like you said, it's not something that you can just flip a switch on, because you've got to move people. One of the things I thought was really important for us to talk about is when you do a digital transformation and you sort of look at the people who are going to be drivers of that from a technology standpoint, being a generalist is okay. Being a full stack developer, being a DevOps person, being willing to, I'll be candid, like be curious. That's one of the things that what we find in digital transformation is really important, both in terms of the people who are doing the technology work, but also the consumers of technology. One of the things that, as an example, we hear a lot about big data and the ability to produce lots of it. But what companies I work with struggle with the most is to be true consumers of the data that they have available and their inability to take that data and draw meaningful insights from it. Part of the reason for that, I think, is because, frankly, they just weren't used to having the richness of information. And part of it is they're just used to having certain things spoon-fed to them, right? So as we transform our organizations to be truly digital and producing volumes of data that can produce insights, those insights don't generate themselves, right? These are people issues, right? These are, the ability to tell a story with data, the ability to develop a discipline in the organization to standardize on what we mean by something. These are all things that aren't necessarily technology issues as they are kind of capability issues within his organization. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think large organizations that have a history probably struggle with that because of the lack of an enterprise data management strategy.
Yes.
Even down to, I've seen crazy things, multiple systems with different definitions and even what an address is or what a name is, standardizing on all of that. So it becomes very difficult for them to actually consolidate all the data into, they talk a lot about data lakes.
Yes.
I think a lot of people end up with what they call data cesspools.
I haven't heard that.
Oh, yeah, you've not heard that? Yeah, I've encountered a few cesspools where the data is, there's no metadata management, so it's very hard to actually extract data from multiple systems, especially multiple systems that might have been developed by multiple companies and brought together through acquisitions. And so there's a lot of that. There's a lot of overlaying of fields. So people couldn't make the change to the code in time. So what they did is, well, if it's a D in the first letter, it means this. If it's a Z, it means this. And crazy kind of overlaying of field definitions depending on, the type of customer and things like that. And that makes it very hard for people to then generate the insights. I think there's a lot of skill set in actually data engineering and data scientists that a lot of the companies just haven't caught up with. So do you see things like that?
I do. I really do, Colin. And I was just thinking about the number of folks who carried, data science lead titles or data and analytics roles who were undone by what you just described. Right. In other words, that they had a grand vision, they had talented people, but they either were unable to get the business to agree to data governance. I mean, literally, so, it's kind of like, the single point of failure was just the inability to do the nuts and bolts of landing on how do we define something, right? And that's not a technology issue, right? I mean, that's a people issue. That's a governance. That's an organizational issue. See it a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of times when companies do acquisitions, there's probably two extreme models. You had like the Cisco model, which is we're going to buy you and you're going to be Ciscoized, right?
Yes.
We're going to basically replace all of your systems. You guys are all going to be starting using our systems, our tools, our processes, all of that. And then the other organization I worked for was Sendon, which was very much, we're going to buy you. We'll do some, we'll do some kind of integration with you on some of the core financial systems, but you're going to be pretty much left alone because we might sell you again in a couple of years. We'll certainly strip a lot of costs out of you. But that was it. And there's these two extreme models.
Yeah.
And I couldn't imagine, if you're not going to standardize on an enterprise data model or do some form of metadata management or data governance, it'd be very hard to start to extract more value across all of these companies because you don't know the data definitions between any two companies, and they'll probably be very inconsistent.
No, I think that's right. And you got me thinking of another problem, which is, often when a company makes an acquisition, presumably there's strategic intent, right? And when there's the retention of that kind of federated model, right? So we're gonna put hooks into our messaging and collaboration systems, our financial systems, and that's it, right? What the opportunity that gets left on the table is the ability to integrate insights across the two different organizations, right? Because presumably if they've been acquired and there's synergies, that means there must be synergies in terms of insights about customers, insights about potential market opportunities. And when those things are kept segregated, it's hard to integrate all the information to tell an interesting story. So in other words, you're not taking advantage of all of the different opportunities really that come from an acquisition and the data and the insights that can be generated when you combine the two organizations. It's hard to do though. I mean, it's a consuming activity.
And then, so how do you see organizations? What's some best practices that you would have for organizations that are going through this acquisition, or even trying to take some of their legacy divisions and correlate all the data across so they have like a single view of their customers?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I think it's the first thing is what you just described. You know, I just worked on a project for a very large logistics company, and they made an explicit decision to pivot from a product, the marketing function, to pivot from a product-based mindset to a customer-based mindset. And you know, while that may seem like, oh, okay, great, but what they had to do was take all of their data and all their thinking of their data science organization and calibrate it towards sort of customer-based questions, right? So how do we segment our customers? How do we understand their different needs? What are the questions that need to be answered? So it's almost, you know, putting aside the very challenging issues of data integration, you know, aligning to you know, disparate systems. It's oftentimes just pivoting the questions and how you organize the analysis towards what you're trying to answer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think, yeah, exactly. I think that makes sense. I always love talking about failures, because it's one of the best ways to learn is looking at companies that have failed and doing these kind of organizational transition.
Yes.
And I was talking to some people, and again, it get back to a Spotify model that they were doing. And they completely forgot that they were going to organize their teams into squads. Mm-hmm. And the squads were going to support these applications. They hadn't quite made it to the product approach yet. But then they'd forgotten about, okay, how are we going to support when there's a big issue? A system is down, it's mission critical. And they basically completely forgot that, oh yeah, we needed to have some form of top line support. So what happens if my data center goes down and multiple applications crash? It's not going to be one single team. It's going to be basically a DR team or a heavy operations group, but they hadn't thought through that. So have you seen, you know, organizations going through this transition, heading into a train wreck? And then how do they get themselves out of it, you know, when they do actually have big problems?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to think of a couple of contexts that, you know, that where this is applicable, because it's applicable a lot. You know, one thing that I find, kind of going back to our discussion earlier about decision rights. When organizations are in a form of, you know, crisis, right? And they're in a scenario that you have to fix something very quickly. I find that it's helpful to have kind of one clear architect of solving the problem, right? So, you know, one person who's, you know, the single throat to choke, for lack of a better term, but he or she needs to have a fairly flat team underneath that is able to kind of mobilize and even experiment on different solutions and report the results. In other words, even when you're dealing with a crisis, you know, it's kind of like the whole concept of you know, build, measure, learn, right? So you have one person who's sort of responsible in a clear way. But as you're trying to come up with solutions, not trying to go for the perfect solution, let's iterate through it. That to me is we often see a lot of really good problem solving that way versus sort of, you need to go away and come back in 3 weeks with the solution. It's more, let's bring it, let's talk about it, let's work through it as a team, and let's try it again. It's that same agile mentality, because honestly, some of these problems are so darn complex, and you learn as you go.
Right.
That to kind of come away again, it's that sort of waterfall mentality. To go away for a long period of time and expect a solution to come back that's perfect is impossible, right? Especially in this complexity.
Well, we see that, and I think there's lots of research with projects. You don't do a 10 million or $100 million project anymore, and then go away and go ta-da, because the ta-da tends to be either wrong or completely doesn't work. And I've been involved in looking at a lot of projects that have failed. And a lot of it is really just don't do big projects, do, incremental builds and improve on it. And probably the same is true with organizations.
Yes.
And just the other thing I've seen is some organizations actually, they will go away for a long time and they think they're being agile, but what they're not doing is they tend to drive a top-down change where, okay, we'll change the top level. Then they get to go change the next level, and then they get to go change the layer below that, etc., etc. Versus looking at more of a vertical kind of slice of, okay, let's try and change these kinds of groups, learn, iterate, do some more, and move through the organization that way. And I think having a vertical look is probably more effective because you can actually learn and adjust as needed versus kind of a top-down approach. Do you see the same thing?
I do. I see it a ton. And, it's kind of like that whole lean startup concept of small batch, right? So let's get something out the door. Let's prove it out. And then, there's a cultural dynamic to what you described, Colin. The whole notion of going away for weeks or months on end, that's been sort of the death knell for IT, for CIOs, right? So a CIO is given a very large ERP deployment, and it's a board level type of visible thing, and he or she comes back in 6 months and says, I'm ready to deploy, and the whole thing goes pear-shaped, and he or she gets fired, right? And what companies are learning is the idea, like you said, that let's do a vertical, right? And let's get something out of this, and let's show and share the learnings. And what I found, even at the executive level, the board level, is there's a high tolerance for accepting imperfect products, and there's a high tolerance for high interest in learning, right? It's kind of like, I think, especially because businesses are knowing how quickly things are moving, being in the know is valuable, and being aware of where things are. And it's not just status reports, not your typical red, yellow, green. It's show me the product. So I'm just echoing your sentiment, and I find that's true at the most senior levels of the organization.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's key is culture, right?
Yes.
And I've worked in organizations to try and change their culture from a more, I would call it, legacy mindset to being a more agile mindset. And it was actually a big shift to actually get there. I actually had to implement a lot of training programs. A lot of people didn't want to give up a lot of aspects, whether it be tools or process or just the way they've done it. We've always done it this way, and it's always worked for us. Kind of mentality, even to the point where it was actually put into some people's goals for end of year reviews, is like, this is the kind of things that we need you to get. Certifications is a great way, especially with the cloud, right? Getting people to think differently is, okay, well, you need to go get a bunch of cloud certifications, because that basically will actually force you to think and realize there are different ways of working versus what you've learned over the last 10, 20 years. And it goes into this whole continuous education process, which really, I think, helps with, cultural adoption of new ways of working.
Oh, I totally agree. And, I was actually working with a client today, and they're a B2C, a large B2C company, and they do a lot of fulfillment, right, obviously, and high volume, complex products that they put together to get to the customer, and they need to be, fresh. And they're going through incredible growth, but also a recognition that the way they've done things so far is not going to get them to the next level of growth. And so part of what this design team landed on was exactly what you've been doing, which is this explicit, purposeful commitment to people development, right?
Right.
And it's so hard to do when your business is growing at 20% a year, right? Because you're like, you're just fighting to kind of get through the week and get product out the door. And, revenue hides a ton of sins, right?
Right.
But now companies are recognizing that that's not, if you want to have a sustainable business, you have to invest in, especially with a war for talent, you have to invest in your people that you currently have, right? And they demand it, like you said. And I mean, they demand it. But it's a tough decision, right? Because you're talking about the opportunity cost of pulling people off the line or pulling them off of their day-to-day and putting them into things that don't have a tangible ROI from the get-go. But companies are seeing it because they're feeling the pain of it, because if they want to move to the new state, they have to have a different mindset. They have to have different ways of thinking. So short answer is absolutely, I'm seeing it.
Yeah, I think the war for talent is a great way of saying it, because it's just interesting. I think now with COVID, it's actually going to get worse, because when I was, in New York, we were shocked when Google and Facebook suddenly said, okay, we're going to start hiring a lot of people, and I actually lost some people to Google. Yeah. I think now, the problem that we have is a lot of these companies, exciting to work for companies, yes, are basically saying we will hire anywhere in the US.
Yes.
So all of a sudden, right, you'll see companies say, okay, we're going to start hiring in Dallas, or we're going to start hiring in places where they didn't have a big presence before, and all of a sudden you see a drain of your talent. And so I think training, for example, is a good way to keep people. Yes, you're going to train people up to a level where they might leave, but you're going to have this high set of talent. And really your job there is to really keep people motivated so that they don't want to pick up the phone when the recruiter calls, or they say, no, I'm happy, I'm doing exciting work, we're leading edge, and people get excited and will stay where they are. Do you see the same thing?
I do. And in fact, similar to the discussion I had today with a client, one of the points was raised, well, some of our executives think that we're going to invest in these people and they're just going to go out ahead and leave, because they're going to take their toolkit and go elsewhere. But in the current, seller's market for talent right now, especially coming, now that we're in recovery, that's a trivial risk relative to the risk of not having people who feel like they're being invested in, right? And developing the capabilities, those softer skills that are needed to, transform the organization. The risk it's completely flipped.
Okay, I think we're about out of time, Tony. So I just want to thank you very much for
my pleasure.
Any kind of parting notes on insights you can give some companies on digital transformation and how to align their organizations?
Yeah, well, thanks for that, and it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Colin. And for me, I think with digital transformation, there's probably a few foundational questions. One is, what is our strategic intent as an enterprise? Start with that question, and is it clear? And can I explain to someone on the street how transforming my organization digitally enables that strategic pivot? And if you can't, ask yourself again if you really want to go down that path. I think the second thing is, look at your capabilities as a company, in terms of technology and the things around it, the processes we've spoken of. But also ask, do you have the right capabilities in your talent pool? Things like, do you have curiosity? Do you have people who have an ability to and an interest in, using insights to make decisions or make changes? Do you have an organization of people who are willing to stick their necks out and make hard decisions? Those are all things that are absolutely foundational to a successful digital transformation. And those are, like you said earlier, those are people and process things just as much as technology. So I hope that's helpful, but it's very interesting stuff.
Okay, great insight. Thanks so much, Tony. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Okay, bye.
Great to talk to you.